And to complete that last bit, biomass, biological material, it's the amount of living organic material in an ecosystem. So again, as photosynthetic organisms build biological material and they grow, that material is biomass. The organisms that consume the photosynthetic organisms, all the consumers, as they grow and they have tissue, etc., that's all biomass. So the amount of living organic material in an ecosystem. So let's talk about how biomass is produced. So primary production is the rate that producers, so photosynthetic organisms, convert solar energy into the chemical energy of biological molecules, or biomass, and it is a huge amount, about 165 billion tons of biomass per year globally. So different ecosystems vary in their primary production and in the contribution to the total biomass production of the world. So for example, you look at this bar graph here, average primary production, how much biomass is produced. Notice that the bars are biggest for algal beds and coral reefs, so shallow ocean ecosystems in warm waters. And then also down here, nice big bar graph, huge amount of production by tropical rainforests. Again, near the equator, getting plenty of solar energy, and those organisms there are very good at producing biomass, converting solar energy into the chemical energy of organic molecules, biomass. Estuaries are very productive. Temperate broadleaf forests are productive. Savanna are productive. Northern coniferous forest, haika, are productive. Cultivated lands, temperate grasslands. And it drops considerably for tundra, desert, and semi-desert scrub, and the open ocean, simply because of temperature, minimal or reduced rainfall, or because there's really not much of a substrate in the open ocean for things to grow on in terms of the primary producers. They're simply floating on the surface. In the ocean environment, most of the biomass primary production is occurring near shore. And of course, it does work its way out via fish and such that do swim into the open ocean. So let's talk about ecological pyramids. So as energy flows as organic molecules and material, biomass, through different trophic levels, feeding trophic levels of an ecosystem, a lot of that material is lost in each trophic level, each link in the food chain. For example, primary consumers, herbivores, the amount of primary producers, plants, the amount of plant biomass that they consume is not converted directly into biomass in those organisms. Some of the material is not digested and they poop it out, right? Defecation. When they do cellular respiration, some of the energy is lost as heat. So only a relatively small percentage goes into body growth, meaning a relatively small percentage of what they consume is converted into biomass. And then the same thing for the secondary consumers. When they eat primary consumers, a relatively small percentage of what they ingest, the biomass is converted into growth, into their own biomass, and etc. and etc. So the amount of biomass, the amount of organic material that's transferred to each subsequent trophic level drops. So energy flows from the producers through the consumers, and only a small percentage is converted into biomass in each subsequent trophic level. So herbivores eat only a fraction of the plant material produced, and they cannot digest all of what they consume. So most of the plant material that's produced is not consumed by herbivores, and what they do digest, what they do ingest, what they do eat, it's not all digested. Some of it's released as fecal material, poop. Some of it's lost as energy for cellular respiration in terms of heat. Some of it's used for movement, etc. And only some of it, a small percentage, is used as growth. Approximately only 10%. So about 35% is expended as cellular respiration, about 5% is transferred into body mass, amount available to consumers to eat. So your textbook mentions this 15%. On average for many herbivores and then subsequent consumers, the amount that gets transferred into biomass, we just rounded off to be approximately 10%. So, pyramid of production, the cumulative loss of energy with each transfer in the food chain. So this block down here represents all the biomass generated by producers via photosynthesis, conversion of solar energy into the chemical energy of biological molecules, the biomass. The primary consumers consume what they eat. They don't eat everything. They don't eat all of the producers. They only eat a certain amount. And only a certain amount is converted into the biomass of the primary consumers. It's roughly 10%. Then the secondary consumers that are eating the primary consumers, approximately 10% of that biomass, in terms of chemical energy, biological molecules, is converted into biomass of the secondary consumers. And then the same thing for the tertiary consumers. And then if there was a quaternary fourth level consumer, again, the transfer of energy in the form of biomass would only be about 10%. So each tier represents all organisms in a trophic level. This is a simple one because it only goes to the third level. The width, size of each tier is a relative amount of energy from the tier below that gets incorporated into the biomass of each trophic level. So what that means is the size, width, whatever dimensions of this trophic level of primary consumers, it represents the amount of energy that's transferred into it in the form of biomass from the producers. And then the size of this block, representing the biomass of the secondary consumers, represents the amount of material that's transferred to it from the primary consumers. Just simply know that, or recognize that that biomass, relatively small, 10% of it gets transferred into the biomass of primary consumers, and again 10%, 10%, 10%. So again, about 10% of energy at each trophic level gets incorporated into the next subsequent higher trophic level. And that's a ballpark number that most ecologists use, 10% transfer of energy in the form of biomass or biological materials, biological molecules. So this explains a few things, that to have a healthy ecosystem, there should be a relatively huge amount of producers producing a lot of biological material. There should be a fair number of primary consumers that take advantage of that material. There should be a substantial fewer number of secondary consumers that are going to take advantage of the primary consumers, and relatively few tertiary consumers that will take advantage of the secondary consumers. So that explains why in an ecosystem there's going to be many plants, individual grasses, etc. Fewer herbivores, fewer carnivores, primary carnivores, which are secondary consumers, and even fewer secondary carnivores. Another way of thinking about this is a certain amount of organism, in this case a secondary consumer or primary carnivore, can only support a certain amount of tertiary consumer or secondary carnivore. So the top predators are relatively few in number relative to the things they eat, and then the things that they eat, and then the things that those guys eat. So that's referred to as ecological pyramids or pyramid of production levels. So the energy available to top-level consumers is relatively small compared to the energy available for lower-level consumers. Kind of what I was just talking about. That's why the top-level consumers, like lions and hawks and cheetahs, require so much territory, because they need to be able to consume a fair amount of material. And then those organisms need a fair amount of territory so that they can consume a greater amount of primary consumers, and the primary consumers need a vast amount of material, or again, a huge amount of material, so that the producers can grow and provide nutrients for them. So this ecological pyramids shows that there's a lot of producers, a fair number of primary consumers, fewer secondary consumers, and relatively few tertiary consumers in a normal, healthy, functioning ecosystem. So it takes a lot of vegetation to support the subsequent trophic levels. So a little bit on humans and how we fit into this whole trophic level business. So the dynamics of energy flow can apply to humans as well. Humans, if they are primary consumers, they use energy much more efficiently than as secondary consumers, because humans can be vegetarians and be completely healthy. But that means they're lower on the food chain, or they're lower in the trophic level hierarchy. If they're primary consumers, they have an ample amount of producers. In this example, corn, it's highly simplified, but plants they can consume. Okay. If humans act more like secondary consumers, meat eaters, carnivores, they have to eat primary consumers, herbivores, but that means that there's less material for them to utilize. Another way of looking at it is we have to grow a fair number, cultivate, right? In farms and such, a fair number of primary consumers. And in order to do that, we have to cultivate a huge amount of agricultural plants to feed the primary consumers in order to feed us. And because of that business of 10% biomass transfer from one level to another, we, if we act as vegetarians, are much more efficient and have to grow less plant material, less farms, less destruction of habitat, versus if we behave as secondary consumers, carnivores, then we have to support a huge or a much larger amount of agriculture, meaning ecological harm, to grow enough herbivores to feed us if we behave as meat eaters. So ecologically speaking, we're much better towards the planet if we act more like vegetarians and more as meat eaters. Of course, this is not one or the other for most people, but what you can do as an individual person to minimize your impact on the planet, harmful impact on the planet, is eat more vegetables, fruits and nuts and grains, act more like a vegetarian versus a meat eater. I'm not saying don't eat meat, but it's actually healthier for you and the planet if we eat less meat and act more like vegetarians. So as the nations become more affluent, the demand for meat increases, and then, of course, then there's the ecological costs of mega farms and food production. Growing cows, cattle, herbivores for human consumption is ecologically not the best thing we can do for the planet, for lots of reasons that we won't even get into in this class. Okay, so let's look at chemical cycling in ecosystems. So life depends on the cycling and recycling of chemicals from the organic to the inorganic realm. Living organisms acquire and release chemicals as nutrients and waste products, and then, of course, when they die, they decompose, like our friendly little fox here. So the molecules of an organism at death are returned to the environment by the action of decomposers, replenishing those materials in the environment.